December 5, 1941. Kloshino, 30 miles west of Moscow. Temperature, minus 38 degrees Celsius. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, the most powerful German military force ever assembled, stood in his command post reading a telegram that would change the course of World War II. After 6 months of devastating victories that brought the Wehrmacht within sight of the Kremlin spires, Hitler was relieving him of command. Not for failure. Not for incompetence. But for telling the truth. Von Bock had warned that his exhausted armies, stretched across a 1,000-mile front in the worst winter in decades, couldn't hold against a massive Soviet counteroffensive he knew was coming. Hitler didn't want to hear it. 3 days earlier, von Bock's intelligence officers had identified fresh Siberian divisions, 143,000 men who'd never seen combat, equipped for winter warfare, moving into position around Moscow. Von Bock pleaded for permission to withdraw to defensible lines. Hitler refused. On December 5, the Soviets attacked with overwhelming force. On December 6, Hitler fired von Bock. This is the story of the general who came closer than anyone to capturing Moscow and was dismissed at the moment of Germany's greatest crisis. To understand how Germany came so close to winning at Moscow and why Hitler destroyed the general who brought him to the brink of victory, we need to understand who Fedor von Bock was. He wasn't like the other Nazi generals. He was Prussian aristocracy, old military tradition, a professional soldier who viewed Hitler's ideological fanaticism with barely concealed contempt. That contempt would cost him everything. Fedor von Bock was born in 1880 into Prussian military aristocracy. His family had produced officers for generations. He fought in World War I, earned the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, and emerged from that war with the same conviction that shaped many of his generation: Germany had been betrayed, not defeated. When Hitler rebuilt the German military in the 1930s, von Bock rose rapidly through the ranks. Not because he was a Nazi, he wasn't. He kept the party at arm's length, refused to attend rallies, and privately mocked Nazi ideology. But he was a brilliant operational commander, and Hitler needed competence more than loyalty. By 1939, von Bock commanded Army Group North in the invasion of Poland. In 1940, he led Army Group B through Belgium and France, reaching the English Channel in just 18 days. His reputation was unmatched, methodical, aggressive when opportunity appeared, and utterly professional. In June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, he gave von Bock the most critical assignment: command of Army Group Center, aimed directly at Moscow. Army Group Center was the most powerful military formation ever assembled. Nearly 2 million men. 48 divisions including 9 panzer divisions. Over 1,000 tanks. 14,000 artillery pieces. 3 air fleets providing air support. Its objective was audacious: drive 650 miles east through Minsk, Smolensk, and straight to Moscow. Destroy the Red Army in massive encirclement battles. Capture the Soviet capital before winter. The invasion began on June 22, 1941 at 0315 hours. Within days, von Bock's armies achieved victories that stunned even German high command. At Minsk, they encircled 300,000 Soviet soldiers. At Smolensk in July, another 300,000. Soviet formations disintegrated. Roads filled with prisoners stumbling west in columns that stretched for miles. Stalin's purges had gutted the Red Army's officer corps. Soviet commanders made catastrophic mistakes launching frontal attacks against German positions, failing to concentrate forces, sometimes not even knowing where their own units were. By early August, von Bock had advanced 400 miles. Moscow was 200 miles away. The road seemed open. Then Hitler made a decision that would haunt the German military forever. On August 21, Hitler ordered von Bock to send his panzer divisions south to help Army Group South capture Ukraine and Kiev. Von Bock protested. Moscow was the objective. The campaigning season was slipping away, every day brought winter closer. If they didn't take Moscow before the Rasputitsa, the autumn rains that turned Russian roads to mud, the offensive would bog down. Hitler dismissed his concerns. The panzers went south. They won another massive victory at Kiev, encircling 665,000 Soviet soldiers. But 6 critical weeks passed. 6 weeks that von Bock believed cost Germany the war. When the panzers returned in late September, the weather was already deteriorating. Von Bock received permission to resume the advance on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. He had one last chance to reach the Soviet capital before winter. Operation Typhoon began on October 2, 1941. For 2 weeks, it looked like another stunning German victory. At Vyazma and Bryansk, von Bock's armies encircled 673,000 more Soviet soldiers. The road to Moscow opened again. By mid-October, German forward units were within 40 miles of the city. Through binoculars, officers could see the sunlight reflecting off the Kremlin's golden domes. Soviet government ministries evacuated east. Stalin considered leaving but ultimately stayed. Foreign embassies fled to Kuibyshev. Moscow prepared for siege, civilians dug anti-tank ditches in frozen ground, barricades went up at major intersections, NKVD units prepared for urban warfare. Then the weather betrayed von Bock completely. The Rasputitsa arrived with savage intensity. Rain fell for 3 weeks straight. Roads that had been dusty tracks became rivers of mud 3 feet deep. Tanks sank to their turrets. Trucks couldn't move. Horses drowned in the muck. Supply columns that should have taken hours took days. Ammunition and food couldn't reach the front. And all the while, the temperature dropped. By early November, the mud froze solid, but that brought no relief. Winter arrived with Arctic fury. On November 7, the temperature plummeted to -12 degrees Celsius. By November 13, -20. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms. The winter clothing that should have been distributed in September was sitting in warehouses in Germany or stuck on railways hundreds of miles west. Hitler had insisted the war would be won before winter, so winter preparations were deemed unnecessary. Now men were freezing. Von Bock's war diary from mid-November records the crisis in clinical language that barely conceals desperation. Frostbite cases exceed battle casualties. Supply situation critical. Vehicles won't start, fuel freezing in tanks. Artillery pieces seize up. Weapons malfunction. Request permission to issue any available winter clothing immediately. The response from Hitler's headquarters: maintain the offensive. Moscow was so close. Through the frozen forests north of the city, German reconnaissance units pushed to within 12 miles of the Kremlin. At Khimki, a northern suburb, they could see Moscow's outskirts through the trees. This was the closest German forces ever came. Then the cold intensified beyond anything they'd experienced. Private letters from von Bock's command reached families in Germany describing conditions that censors would have suppressed if they'd intercepted them. One company commander wrote, "We are no longer fighting the Russians. We are fighting the cold. Men sleep 4 to a sleeping bag for warmth. In the morning, we find some haven't woken up. Their bodies are frozen solid before we can bury them. We've lost more men to frostbite than to enemy action this week. My friend Klaus lost all his toes. The medic amputated them with an ordinary saw because they were dead tissue. He didn't even need anesthetic. Klaus couldn't feel his feet anymore." Von Bock understood his army was reaching its breaking point. But Soviet intelligence terrified him more than the weather. His intelligence staff showed him reports that should have changed everything. Soviet radio intercepts indicated massive troop movements from Siberia. Entire fresh armies, trained and equipped for winter warfare, were detraining at Moscow's eastern stations. Units that had never fought, led by commanders who hadn't been purged, with winter uniforms and weapons that actually functioned in sub-zero temperatures. Von Bock did something that required extraordinary courage. He told Hitler the truth. On November 28, he sent a message to the Führer's headquarters at the Wolfschanz in East Prussia. The tone was direct and unambiguous. Army Group Center could not continue offensive operations. The men were exhausted. Casualties, from combat and frostbite combined, had gutted his divisions. Each division was at 40 to 50% strength. Supply lines were breaking down. The Soviets were bringing fresh forces forward while German strength diminished daily. Von Bock requested permission to establish a shortened defensive line, pull back from the most exposed salients, and prepare winter positions. Hitler's response came swiftly. Permission denied. The offensive would continue. Moscow must be taken. Withdrawal was weakness. The will to victory would overcome material difficulties. Von Bock tried again on December 1, this time more urgent. Soviet forces were massing opposite his positions in greater strength than his intelligence had predicted. An attack was imminent. His armies needed to withdraw or they risked encirclement and destruction. Again, Hitler refused. What von Bock didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to detect, was the true scale of what was coming. Stalin and his chief of staff, General Georgy Zhukov, had been secretly assembling a strategic reserve of Siberian and Far Eastern divisions for months. These weren't the shattered remnants of the armies destroyed in summer and autumn. These were fresh formations, the 1st Shock Army, 10th Army, 20th Army, and others, 143,000 men trained specifically for winter operations. They wore quilted winter uniforms, felt boots that kept feet warm to -40 degrees, fur-lined caps. They carried submachine guns that functioned in extreme cold. They moved on skis through forests where German vehicles couldn't go. Soviet intelligence had confirmed through their spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorg, that Japan would not attack Siberia, which freed these divisions for transfer west. On December 5 at 0300 hours, the temperature was -38 degrees Celsius. Along a 200-mile front around Moscow, Soviet artillery opened fire. The counteroffensive had begun. German positions, thinly held, men already at the edge of endurance, faced overwhelming assault. In some sectors, Soviet troops outnumbered Germans 10 to 1. The German lines shattered. Units that had pushed to within miles of Moscow suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting for survival in temperatures that made combat almost impossible. Weapons froze. Tank engines wouldn't start even with fires lit underneath them. Frostbite incapacitated thousands within hours. Von Bock's headquarters became a crisis management center, fielding desperate calls from commanders across the front. One division reported it had been encircled and was down to 15% combat strength. Another reported Soviet forces had broken through and were attacking supply depots 30 miles behind the line. A panzer commander reported his entire tank battalion was immobilized, frozen solid. Von Bock made a command decision that by any military logic was correct but politically fatal. He ordered tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions. His units would pull back, shorten the line, establish winter defensive positions where they could actually survive and hold. From a military perspective, this was the only rational choice. The alternative was watching his armies be destroyed piecemeal. He sent word to Hitler's headquarters explaining the situation and the action he'd taken. Hitler's response was instantaneous and volcanic. December 16, 1941. Hitler issued Directive 39, there would be no retreat. Not one step backward. Every position would be held. Any commander who authorized withdrawal would be relieved of command and court-martialed. The order was militarily insane but psychologically revealing. Hitler had come to believe that willpower alone could overcome material reality. He'd witnessed the rapid victories of 1939 to 1941 and concluded that Nazi ideology, the superiority of German soldiers, the power of the will, could triumph over logistics, weather, and mathematics. Von Bock's withdrawal order had shattered that delusion. If German armies retreated, it meant they weren't invincible. It meant the Wehrmacht could be defeated. Hitler couldn't accept that. On December 18, Field Marshal von Bock received the telegram. He was relieved of command effective immediately, officially due to health reasons, a face-saving lie. The truth was clear to everyone: he'd been fired for retreating, for telling Hitler what he didn't want to hear, for choosing military reality over ideological fantasy. Von Bock's chief of staff later wrote in his diary, "The field marshal accepted his dismissal with dignity. He said only, 'I did what any competent commander would do.'" Apparently competence is no longer required. Von Bock wasn't alone. In the weeks following his dismissal, Hitler fired dozens of senior commanders. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, resigned in protest. General Guderian, the legendary panzer commander, was relieved for ordering a retreat. Colonel General Hopner was not only dismissed but expelled from the army and stripped of his pension for withdrawing his panzer group. The purge was comprehensive and devastating. Hitler replaced professional soldiers who understood military reality with ideologically reliable officers who would follow orders without question. He assumed personal command of the army, making strategic decisions from his headquarters in East Prussia, hundreds of miles from the front. The consequences would unfold over the next 3 years. But in December 1941, the immediate result was catastrophic. Hitler's stand-fast order meant German units couldn't maneuver, couldn't withdraw from untenable positions, couldn't establish coherent defensive lines. They simply had to hold wherever they stood, regardless of whether those positions made military sense. Some units were annihilated. Others held through sheer determination and suffering beyond comprehension. By January 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive had pushed German forces back 60 to 150 miles along most of the Moscow front. The immediate threat to the Soviet capital was gone. Army Group Center had suffered catastrophic casualties, some divisions were at 20% strength. Over 100,000 German soldiers had been lost to frostbite alone, with many requiring amputation of fingers, toes, hands, or feet. The Wehrmacht would never again possess the offensive power it had in the summer and autumn of 1941. But, and this is critical to understanding what happened, the German army didn't collapse. Hitler's stand-fast order, insane as it seemed to professional officers, may have prevented a complete rout. By refusing to allow an organized retreat, Hitler forced units to hold positions that acted as breakwaters against the Soviet advance. The Wehrmacht stabilized the front by late January. The question military historians have debated ever since is impossible to answer with certainty. What if von Bock had been allowed to conduct an organized withdrawal in early December? Would that have preserved more of Army Group Center's combat power while still preventing Soviet breakthrough? Or would a retreat have turned into a panicked rout, a Napoleonic disaster in the Russian winter? Von Bock himself left few public comments about his dismissal. He was a Prussian officer, duty and discipline had been drilled into him since childhood. Publicly criticizing his commander-in-chief was unthinkable. But his private letters and diary reveal his thoughts. In a letter to his sister in January 1942, he wrote, "I am confident history will judge whether I acted correctly. I placed the welfare of my soldiers above political considerations. If that is a crime, then I am guilty. But I will sleep well knowing I did my duty as a commander, which is to accomplish the mission while preserving my forces to the maximum extent possible. I could not stand by and watch brave men be sacrificed for a fantasy." He spent the winter of 1942 in forced retirement. But Hitler wasn't finished with him. In a pattern that would repeat throughout the war, Hitler would fire generals in moments of crisis, then recall them when he needed their competence. In January 1943, von Bock was given command of Army Group South during another crisis. He served for 6 months before being dismissed again, this time permanently, for similar reasons, telling Hitler truths he didn't want to hear. The question that haunts this story is unanswerable but unavoidable. Could von Bock have taken Moscow if Hitler hadn't sent his panzers south in August? Most military historians believe he could have. The Soviet capital was thinly defended in August 1941. The Siberian divisions hadn't arrived yet. The weather was still favorable. A direct thrust might have succeeded. If Moscow had fallen, would the Soviet Union have collapsed? Probably not. Stalin had prepared contingencies to continue the war from beyond the Urals. The Soviet state was more resilient than Hitler imagined. But taking Moscow would have been devastating, psychologically, logistically, and politically. It might have extended the war, increased Soviet casualties, perhaps changed the timeline of victory. We'll never know. What we do know is that by December 1941, von Bock had brought Germany as close to victory on the Eastern Front as it would ever come. 12 miles from the Kremlin. Within sight of Moscow's outskirts. Then Hitler fired the general who'd brought him there, at the exact moment when von Bock's judgment was most needed. It's a pattern that would repeat throughout the war, Hitler overruling his generals, dismissing those who questioned him, making strategic decisions based on ideology rather than military reality. Fedor von Bock never received another field command. He spent the final 2 years of the war in retirement at his estate in Holstein. On May 3, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, a British fighter bomber strafed a civilian car on a German road. Von Bock was inside. He died the next day from his wounds at age 64. His last words, according to the driver who survived, were questions about whether his wife was safe. There's a tragic irony in his death, killed by the Western Allies whose advance might have been delayed if Hitler had listened to von Bock's advice in 1941. His reputation among military historians has been complex. Some see him as a brilliant operational commander hamstrung by Hitler's interference. Others note that he served the Nazi regime faithfully until it no longer wanted him, that he executed orders in conquered territories without apparent moral hesitation, that his opposition to Hitler was professional rather than ethical. Both perspectives hold truth. Von Bock was a Prussian military professional who valued competence and operational success above ideology, but who placed those skills in service of a criminal regime. What can we learn from von Bock's story? First, the limits of military competence when divorced from moral judgment. Von Bock was operationally brilliant. His encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk demonstrated tactical genius. But he placed the genius in service of a criminal enterprise. He never wavered in his loyalty to Germany, but he never questioned what Germany was fighting for. Second, the tension between professional military judgment and political authority. Von Bock represented the old Prussian military tradition that believed politics and warfare should be separate spheres. Hitler demolished that separation, making every military decision a political one. Von Bock couldn't adapt to that reality. Third, the simple truth that telling powerful people what they don't want to hear requires courage and often carries a price. Von Bock told Hitler the truth about Army Group Center's condition in December 1941. He was fired for it. But his judgment was vindicated. The Wehrmacht never recovered its offensive power after the Moscow campaign. The Eastern Front became a grinding war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. The forests outside Moscow are quiet now. Where German soldiers advanced through snow in December 1941, there are memorial markers and small museums. Russian veterans placed simple monuments at the furthest points of the German advance, Khimki to the north, other positions around the perimeter. The inscriptions are straightforward: here the fascist invasion was halted. No triumphalism. Just fact. Fedor von Bock died believing he'd been right, that had Hitler allowed him to conduct an organized withdrawal and establish winter positions in December 1941, the German army might have held a stronger position for a renewed offensive in 1942. We'll never know if he was correct. What we do know is that the Moscow campaign represented Germany's best chance of victory on the Eastern Front. Von Bock brought them to the edge of success. Then winter, logistics, and Hitler's refusal to accept reality combined to create disaster. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, not to glorify war or celebrate generals, but to understand how human decisions, made under impossible pressure, shape history's course. Von Bock made tactical decisions to save his soldiers' lives. Hitler made ideological decisions to preserve his myth of invincibility. 20 million Soviet citizens and 5 million German soldiers would perish in the years that followed. The truth von Bock tried to tell in December 1941, that the Wehrmacht had reached its limits, was one Hitler never accepted. And millions paid the price for that delusion.